Thank you for the applause. Hello, my name is Kathy Schlen-Viles, and I am the chair of the UConn Reads Selection Committee. I want to thank each of you for coming to this event, and I have the wonderful job of introducing the program. After offering some brief comments about the initiative and its mission, I will turn things over to Provost Craig Kennedy, who will introduce our UConn Reads author, Viet Thanh Nguyen. A Q&A will follow Professor Nguyen's keynote address, and this portion of the program, which is open to the entire audience, will be moderated by Jeremy Teitelbaum, Professor of Mathematics, former Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. Professor Nguyen has generously agreed to a book signing after the Q&A has concluded. Since 2011, the University of Connecticut has hosted UConn Reads, a common reading program envisioned as a book discussion open to the entire university community. An initiative begun by President Herbst, UConn Reads aims via its mission and vision statement to gather together students, staff, alumni, faculty, and state citizens alike who share an interest and sense of pride in the university, who relish intelligent, respectful debate, and who can bring their own individual perspectives and personal experiences to a thought-provoking, engaging discussion. Each year, the UConn Reads Selection Committee pursues a particular theme. Such a focus is intended to engender debate and activity within and outside the traditional confines of the classroom. Situated adjacent a contemporary terrain marked by heated debates over refugee asylum, travel bans, and immigration policy, it is more than fitting that we as a selection committee and university community contemplate this year's theme, the conundrum and challenge of immigration. Given the current state of America's migratory landscape, it is equally apt that this year's UConn Reads selection is the aforementioned Viet Thanh Nguyen, whose provocative and evocative short story collection, The Refugees, was selected after initial call for nominations was issued last year. It is now my distinct pleasure to formally introduce Craig H. Kennedy, Provost and Executive Vice President for Academic Affairs at the University of Connecticut. Prior to his appointment at UConn, Provost Kennedy served as the Dean of the College of Education at the University of Georgia. A native of California, he earned his BA in psychology from the University of California at Santa Barbara and his MS in special education from the University of Oregon. And then he returned to UC Santa Barbara to earn his PhD in education. Please help me welcome Provost Kennedy to the stage.
Thank you very much, Kathy. It's my pleasure today to introduce Viet Thanh Nguyen, whose novel, The Sympathizer, is a New York Times bestseller and won the 2016 Pulitzer Prize for fiction. Other honors include the Dayton Literary Peace Prize, the Edgar Allan for Best First Novel from the Mystery Writers of America, the Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Fiction from the American Library Association, the First Novel Prize from the Center for Fiction, a gold medal in first fiction from the California Book Awards, the Best Work of Creative Fiction from the Association of Asian American Studies, and the Asian Pacific American Literature Award from the Asian Pacific American Librarian Association. His other books are Nothing Ever Dies, Vietnam and a Memory of War, a finalist for the National Book Award in Nonfiction, and the National Book Critics Circle Award in General Nonfiction, and Race and Resistance, Literature and Politics in Asian America. He is the Errol Arnold Chair of English and Professor of English, American Studies, and Ethnicity and Comparative Literature at the University of Southern California. He has been interviewed by Tavis Smiley, Charlie Rose, Seth Meyers, and Terry Gross, among many others. His current book is the best-selling short story collection, The Refugees, which, as Kathy just noted, is this year's UConn's Read selection. Most recently, he has been the recipient of fellowships from the Guggenheim and MacArthur Foundation, and the Best Foreign Book in France award. He's a critic at large for the Los Angeles Times and a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times. His edited collection, The Displaced, Refugee Writers on Refugee Lives, was published this spring. Please join me in welcoming Viet Thanh Nguyen.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Hi. Thanks so much, Provost Kennedy. Thanks to all of you for being out here tonight. I can't really see you that well, but I'm still going to do my best to try this. I can't help it. I'm Asian. Well, besides being Asian, one of the things that I am is a refugee, and that's obviously why you have me here tonight. And I came to this country as a refugee in 1975 when the Vietnam War ended and my parents fled from Vietnam and took me with them. And we ended up at Fort Indiantown Gap in Pennsylvania, which was one of 4 refugee camps that Vietnamese people ended up in. And that's a long time ago. And so sometimes I think, should I still call myself a refugee? Because obviously, if you look at me, it's clear that I've made this transition from refugee to bourgeoisie. But something in me persists in hanging on to that identity of being a refugee, and I think partly it's because my memories really start in that refugee camp in Fort Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania. Because when we got there, in order to leave, Vietnamese refugees needed sponsors to get out of the camp. And in our case, no single sponsor would take our entire family. So one sponsor took my parents, one sponsor took my 10-year-old brother, and one sponsor took 4-year-old me. And now I'm the father of a 4-year-old son. And when I look at him and I think back to what I must have been like, I think about how painful that experience must have been for my parents to have their child taken away from me, just as painful as it would be for me if my son was taken away. And I definitely do remember that this is where my memories begin, with the pain and the trauma of being separated from parents and sent to live with this very nice American sponsor family, but still nevertheless strangers to me. And so that's where memory begins, and in that sense, being a refugee has always been there at the back of my mind. And now, in our current climate, where refugees are a crisis for the United States and a crisis for many other countries, it seems to me that it's even more urgent to keep on claiming this identity of being a refugee, since it's so tempting for people who are refugees or have been refugees to pretend that they're not, and to go around in disguise as immigrants or as Americans, when those of us who are refugees should be asserting that history and that identity in order to support the people who are now truly refugees. And I've spent decades of my life trying to make sense of what my refugee experience has meant to me and to this country. And I've understood that for me to be a refugee is inseparable from the history of war, specifically the Vietnam War, but really war in general. And so the last few books that I've written, The Sympathizer, the Refugees, and Nothing Ever Dies, have all grappled with this intersection of war and refugees. So I wanted to start off, actually, before we get to the refugees, with a couple of readings from The Sympathizer, because The Sympathizer really is a novel that, besides being a war novel, is a novel about refugees, and it makes a case that we need to think of these two experiences together. And for those of you who don't know the plot of The Sympathizer, it's about a communist spy in the South Vietnamese army in April 1975. And when Saigon falls or is liberated, depending on your point of view, his task is to flee with the remnants of that army to the United States, where he's going to spy on their efforts to take their country back. And in order to do so, he has to become a refugee. And he ends up in the much more glamorous refugee camp of Camp Pendleton in Southern California. And here, in this first scene, he's going to write a letter to his aunt in Paris describing what life in a refugee camp is like. If allowed to stay together, I told my aunt, we could have incorporated ourselves into a respectably sized, self-sufficient colony, a pimple on the buttocks of the American body politic, sufficiently collective to elect our own representative to the Congress and have a voice in our America. A little Saigon as delightful, delirious, and dysfunctional as the original, which was exactly why we were not allowed to stay together, but were instead dispersed by bureaucratic fiat. Wherever we found ourselves, we found each other. We did our best to conjure up the culinary staples of our culture, but since we were dependent on Chinese markets, Our food had an unacceptably Chinese tinge. Another blow in the gauntlet of our humiliation that left us with a sweet and sour taste of unreliable memories. Just correct enough to evoke the past, just wrong enough to remind us that the past was forever gone, missing, along with the proper variety, subtlety, and complexity of our universal solvent, fish sauce. Oh, fish sauce. How we missed it. How nothing tasted right without it. This pungent, liquid condiment of the darkest sepia hue was much denigrated by foreigners for its supposedly horrendous reek, lending new meaning to the phrase, "There's something fishy around here," for we were the fishy ones. We used fish sauce the way Transylvanian villagers wore cloves of garlic to ward off vampires, in our case to establish a perimeter with those Westerners who could never understand that what was truly fishy was the nauseating stench of cheese. What was fermented fish compared to curdled milk? But out of deference to our hosts, we kept our feelings to ourselves, sitting close to one another on prickly sofas and scratchy carpets, our knees touching under crowded kitchen tables, chewing on dried squid and the cud of remembrance until our jaws ached, trading stories heard second and third hand about our scattered countrymen. This was the way we learned of the Klan turned into slave labor by a farmer in Modesto, and the naive girl who flew to Spokane to marry her GI sweetheart and was sold to a brothel, and the widower with 9 children who went out into a Minnesotan winter and laid down in the snow on his back with mouth open until he was buried and frozen, and the regretful refugees on Guam who petitioned to go back to Vietnam, never to be heard from again, and the devout Buddhist who spanked his young son and was arrested for child abuse in Houston, and the husband who slapped his wife and was jailed for domestic violence in Raleigh, and the men who had escaped but left wives behind in the chaos, and the women who had escaped but left husbands behind, and the children who had escaped without parents and grandparents, and the families missing 1, 2, 3, or more children. Sifting through the dirt, we panned for gold. The story of the baby orphan adopted by a Kansas billionaire, or the mechanic who bought a lottery ticket in Arlington and became a multimillionaire, or the girl elected president of her high school class in Baton Rouge, or the boy accepted by UConn from Fond du Lac. I'm just kidding. It's actually Harvard. I'm sure you've heard the comparison before. Or the movie star you loved so much, dear aunt, who circled the world from airport to airport, no country letting her in after the fall of Saigon, none of her American movie star friends returning her desperate phone calls until with her last dime, she snagged Tippi Hedren, who flew her to Hollywood. So it was that we soaped ourselves in sadness, and we rinsed ourselves with hope, and for all that we believed almost every rumor we heard, almost all of us refused to believe that our nation was dead. So the Tippi Hedren story is true, and I realize that the college students out there probably don't even know who Tippi Hedren is, but she's a famous movie star, and the South Vietnamese movie star was Viet Thanh Nguyen, and Tippi Hedren came to Camp Pendleton and took such pity on the Vietnamese refugees that she encountered that she had her personal manicurist come to Camp Pendleton and train some of these women in the arts of manicuring, which is how 40 years later, we Vietnamese people have come to take over 51% of the nail salon industry in this country. True story. Now that's either a pro-refugee story or an anti-refugee story, depending on your point of view. And of course, I think it's a pro-refugee story. And I bring it up because I think one of the reasons why refugees seem so threatening to Americans and to others is they are threatening to take away jobs. And they're different than immigrants. And I really want to stress that distinction because when the novel came out, something happened that I knew was going to happen, which is that many of the reviews called this an immigrant novel and called me an immigrant writer. And I had to insist, no, that's not true. This is a refugee novel and I'm a refugee writer. I'm a refugee. And the distinction between refugees and immigrants is really, really crucial to draw. Because in this country, even though we're living at a time of rising xenophobia against refugees and immigrants, there's something about the immigrant that makes the immigrant a part of the American mythology, a part of the American dream. Even if you're someone who opposes the idea of more immigrants coming to the United States, you still believe that the immigrant wants to come here because we're awesome. The immigrant affirms who we are as Americans. But the refugee is different. The refugee is unwanted where they come from and unwanted where they're coming to. And there's something also very American about not wanting to believe that we're refugees, or could be refugees. And I'll give you an example. Some of these Vietnamese refugees who came to the United States in the 1970s eventually ended up settling in Louisiana. And then a couple of decades later, something called Hurricane Katrina happened. And tens of thousands of people were displaced. And some of the American media who covered this displacement called these people refugees. And President George Bush said, it's un-American to call these people refugees. And for perhaps the only time in history, Jesse Jackson agreed with him. A lot of these people were African Americans, and Jesse Jackson said, it's racist to call African Americans refugees. And I thought, great, we refugees have brought America together in hating us. So I think the American dream just does not allow for the possibility that America could be a failed state that could produce refugees. And so the arrival of refugees in this country, I think, brings with them this troubling possibility. And I think it's one reason why many Americans have been so vociferous against the possibility of taking refugees into this country. And unfortunately, some of those Americans who are not inclined to take in refugees happen to be former refugees, including some of my Vietnamese brothers and sisters. And these former refugees who are Vietnamese say, we're the good refugees. But some of these people, the Syrians, for example, they're the bad refugees. And I know Vietnamese people. I grew up among Vietnamese people in the 1970s and the 1980s. And while there are some people, like my brother, who are the model minority, he came here when he was 7 or 8 years old, didn't speak any English, and then 9 years later, went to Harvard. My parents never let me live that one down. There are some people like him. But during the 1970s and 1980s, there were a lot of Vietnamese people doing things like cheating on welfare and doing cash under the table economy. So there were some bad refugees among us too. Right? So we weren't just the good refugees. We were the lucky refugees. Because in the 1970s, it was good politics for the United States to take in refugees from a newly communist country, because of course, those refugees would want to come here. We're awesome. And I also know that in 1975, a lot of Americans, actually the majority of Americans, did not want to take Vietnamese refugees or refugees from Cambodia or Laos, the other countries where the Vietnam War was fought. And I had a very personal reminder of that feeling among some of the American people. So here it is. My parents, after settling in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania in 1975, moved 3 years later to the Promised Land, California, San Jose. And my parents opened perhaps the second Vietnamese grocery store in San Jose, California. And when I was around 10 or 11 years old, I was walking down the street near my parents' store, and I saw a sign in a store window. And it said, "Another American driven out of business by the Vietnamese." And I thought, do you know that my parents work 12 to 14-hour days in this grocery store? Do you know that my parents were shot in this store in an armed robbery on Christmas Eve? Do you know what my parents have had to go through to become the people that they are and to get to this country? And of course, whoever put that sign in the window didn't know these kinds of things. It took me a long time to make sense out of that sign and to understand how it fit into our larger American story. A long time. But by the time I got to high school, I was not there yet. I went to this very elite white high school, primarily white high school, and there were a handful of us who were of Asian descent. And we knew we were different somehow. And every day for lunch, we'd gather in a corner of the campus, and we call ourselves the Asian Invasion. I've actually visited my high school last year, some 30 years after I graduated, and the funny thing is, we really have taken over. But that's another story. But in the back of our heads, I think, we knew that we were the Asian invasion because we were somehow associated with the wars that the United States had fought in the Philippines, in Korea, in the Pacific, and in Vietnam. And I grew up aware of this thing called the Vietnam War. I was very, very curious about it. And I wanted to understand what was the Vietnam War and eventually what was war in general. And this is what I think I've learned, which is that in the United States, when we say the word Vietnam, people usually mean the Vietnam War. And when people say the Vietnam War, they really mean the American War, how this war has impacted Americans. And it has impacted Americans. It killed over 58,000 American soldiers and divided the country. But it was also a war that killed 3 million Vietnamese people and killed 3 million Laotians and Cambodians too. And I think a lot of Americans have never known that or have forgotten that. And when I was growing up surrounded by Vietnamese refugees, I knew that this war had impacted all of them. And they weren't just soldiers, because in the United States, when we say the word war, I think we also think men, soldiers, guns, battles, tanks. But the Vietnam War was not unusual. In fact, it was typical for killing more civilians than soldiers in the 20th century. So why, when we say war, do we think of men and soldiers? We should also be thinking of civilians and of refugees. And in growing up in that refugee community, I was surrounded by people who were angry and bitter and melancholic about all the things that they had lost. Their country, their identities, their relatives, everything. And so growing up amongst them, I knew that the war had actually not ended. And when we talk about wars, I think we like to think that wars have a beginning and an end. So for Americans, the war began in 1964, ended in 1975, and that was it. But in traveling around and giving lectures and meeting many Americans who had lived that time period, either as soldiers or just as civilians who were here protesting against the war, or just witnessing it on TV, I realized that for so many of these people, the war hasn't really ended for them as well. It remains the defining event of their lives for so many of them. And likewise for Vietnamese people, the Vietnamese refugees that I grew up among, I realized that for them, what I said in Nothing Ever Dies was true. And that is that all wars are fought twice. The first time on the battlefield, and the second time in memory. And for these Vietnamese refugees and these Americans who had been deeply affected by the war, they have continued to fight that war again in their memories over and over and over. And when I was a boy growing up in the 1970s and 1980s, I was really aware of that because I watched a lot of movies. During the 1970s and 1980s, Hollywood fought the Vietnam War again on screen. And in around 1980 or 1981, my parents brought something home called the VCR. And after watching Star Wars, Episode 4, the original Star Wars, a dozen times on the VCR, I found something called Apocalypse Now. And I just met with some students this afternoon, and when I talked about this, I realized they have no idea what Apocalypse Now is. They never heard of this movie, much less seen it. But for people of our generation who grew up, Apocalypse Now was a major thing. And no matter where I go around this world and people realize that I'm researching the Vietnam War, inevitably someone asks me, have you seen Apocalypse Now? And so Apocalypse Now became very personal for me. And for those of you who don't know, it's basically a movie about American soldiers in Vietnam, and they do terrible things. Okay? And I was 10 or 11 when I watched that movie, at much too young of an age. This is what happens when you bring cutting-edge technology into your house and you give your kids unsupervised time with it. So I watched all kinds of things I shouldn't have watched. And I was an American. I loved war movies. I loved American war movies. I identified with American soldiers. And in watching Apocalypse Now, I was identifying with American soldiers up until the point they killed Vietnamese people. And then I was split in two. Was I the American doing the killing, Or was I the Vietnamese being killed? And I didn't realize how traumatic of an experience that was for me until a decade later, when I was recounting this scene to a college classroom, and I found my voice shaking in rage and anger and disgust. And I realized just how powerful stories are. Maybe they're not as traumatic as actual violence, but the symbolic violence that stories do is really powerful. And when you're a part of the majority, all the stories are about you. So you take the power of those stories for granted. And if one or two stories is not very good, it doesn't mean anything. But when you're a minority, almost none of the stories are about you. And so when stories appear in which you are featured, they become enormously important. And when you appear in them only as a stereotype, and then in the case of the Vietnamese, we appear in these American movies only to be shot or raped or rescued by Americans, these representations become so powerful and damaging for us. So when it came time to write The Sympathizer, I felt, now is my time to take revenge on Hollywood. So after my narrator leaves the refugee camp, he has to get a job. And one of the jobs that he gets is to become the authenticity consultant on the making of a movie that looks suspiciously like Apocalypse Now. But if Francis Ford Coppola or his lawyer is to ask, it's not about Apocalypse Now. Okay? The movie is called The Hamlet in the book, and it's actually a compendium of all the American movies about the Vietnam War, and I've seen almost all of them, and it's an exercise I recommend to nobody. So in this movie, The Hamlet, American Green Berets are sent to Vietnam, to the Central Highlands, and their task is to train the ethnic minorities, whom they call the Montagnards, to defend themselves against communism. And so in this scene, our narrator, the spy, has given the director of this movie notes on the screenplay, and he and the director, who is known only as the auteur, are going to have a tense conversation. My meeting with the auteur had gone on for a while longer, mostly in a more subdued fashion, with me pointing out that the lack of speaking parts for Vietnamese people in a movie set in Vietnam might be interpreted as cultural insensitivity. Do you not think it would be a little more believable, I said, a little more realistic, a little more authentic for a movie set in a certain country, for the people in that country to have something to say, instead of having your screenplay direct, as it does now, cut to villagers speaking in their own language? Do you think it might not be decent to let them actually say something, instead of simply acknowledging that there's some kind of sound coming from their mouths? Could you not even just have them speak a heavily accented English? You know what I mean. Ching Chong English, just to pretend that they are speaking in an Asian language that somehow American audiences can strangely understand? The auteur grimaced and said, "Very interesting. Great stuff. Loved it. But I had a question. How many movies have you made?" None. Isn't that right? None. Zero. Zilch. Nada. Nothing. And however you say it in your language. So thank you for telling me your opinion about my movie. Now get the hell out of my house, and maybe I'll listen to one or two of your cheap ideas after you've made a movie or two. And the interesting thing is, after this book came out, I've met quite a few Hollywood people, and none of them dispute this characterization. I confess to being angry with the auteur, but was I wrong in being angry? This was especially the case when he acknowledged he did not even know that Montagnard was simply a French catch-all term for the dozens of Highland minorities. What if, I said to him, I wrote a screenplay about the American West and simply called all the natives Indians? You'd want to know whether the cavalry was fighting the Navajo or Apache or Comanche, right? Likewise, I would want to know, when you say these people are Montagnards, whether we speak of the Bru, or the Nung, or the Tay. Let me tell you a secret, the auteur said. You ready? Here it is. No one gives a shit. He was amused by my wordlessness. To see me without words is like seeing one of those Egyptian felines without hair, a rare and not necessarily desirable occasion. How could I be so dense? How could I be so deluded? I naively believed that I could divert the Hollywood organism from its goal, the simultaneous lobotomization and pickpocketing of the world's audiences. Hollywood did not just make horror movie monsters, it was its own horror movie monster, smashing me under its foot. I had failed, and the auteur would make the Hamlet as he intended, with my countrymen serving merely as raw material for an epic about white men saving good yellow people from bad yellow people. I pitied the French for their naivete in believing they had to visit a country in order to exploit it. Hollywood was much more efficient, imagining the countries it wanted to exploit. I was maddened by my helplessness before the auteur's imagination and machinations. His arrogance marked something new in the world, for this was the first war where the losers would write history instead of the victors, courtesy of the most efficient propaganda machine ever created, with all due respect to Joseph Goebbels and the Nazis, who never achieved global domination. Hollywood's high priests understood innately the observation of Milton's Satan, that it was better to rule in hell than serve in heaven, better to be villain, loser, or anti-hero than virtuous extra, so long as one commanded the bright lights of center stage. In this forthcoming Hollywood trompe-l'oeil, all the Vietnamese of any side would come out poorly, herded into the roles of the poor, the innocent, the evil, or the corrupt. Our fate was not to be merely mute. We were to be struck dumb. So that was what it was like to be a refugee in the 1970s and 1980s, knowing that all these stories were being told about Vietnam, but they were really about the Vietnam War, and they really weren't about Vietnamese people like the refugees I grew up among. And when the novel came out, something else happened that I knew was going to happen. And that is that in one of the first major reviews of the book, which was a very positive review, the reviewer said in the third line, "Viet is the voice for the voiceless." And I was like, no! Have you ever met any Vietnamese people? Been to a Vietnamese restaurant? Been to Vietnam? We're really, really loud. The problem is not that we're voiceless. It's that we're not heard. And this is a condition that we share with so many other minorities and disempowered populations in this country and elsewhere. And so that idea of being a voice for the voiceless is something that we hear really often whenever a hot new writer comes out. This will be the voice for the voiceless. And that's meant to be praise, but it's actually not. Because when we say that someone is a voice for the voiceless, what we're really saying is that we'd rather listen to just one voice rather than a chorus of voices, or in the case of Vietnamese people, a cacophony of voices. I'm not really interested in being a voice for the voiceless. And I don't think true justice, when it comes to storytelling and challenging what we mean when we say America, true justice doesn't come by having more voices for the voiceless. True justice will happen when we have no more voiceless people. And the only way we achieve that is partially through stories. We need stories to broaden our imagination and gesture toward this possibility, but we really need social and political movements that would transform our society so that there won't be any more voiceless people. And that's going to take a lot of work. That's why I always think of myself as a writer who works in conjunction with these social and political movements that have come before me and exist right now that make it possible for me to be a writer. And that's also why, when I wrote The Refugees, I was really worried about what it meant to speak for Vietnamese people, because I knew that I would be read as a voice for the voiceless. And I knew from everything that I'd encountered with Vietnamese refugees and the Vietnamese people in Vietnam that they're really, really different. They're diverse. Right? You take a dozen Vietnamese people, they're not the same. They're going to have a dozen different stories. And so that's why in The Refugees, it was really crucial for me to show that Vietnamese people were not the same. The stories are mostly about Vietnamese people or the people who encounter them, but they're also about the fact that Vietnamese people are men and women, they're straight and gay, they're old and young. They're really, really different from each other. But what unifies the collection, besides being about Vietnamese people and about refugees, is that the collection is also about being haunted by the past. Because one of the things that seemed so obvious to me as I grew up among these Vietnamese refugees is that so many of them were haunted. They were haunted by literal ghosts sometimes, but they were just as often haunted by these figurative ghosts of everything that they had lost and everybody that they had left behind. So I'm going to read from the opening story of the refugees, Black-Eyed Women, which is very much about haunting. Fame would strike someone, usually the kind that healthy-minded people would not wish upon themselves, such as being kidnapped and kept prisoner for years, humiliated in a sex scandal, or surviving something, typically fatal. These survivors needed someone to help write their memoirs, and their agents might eventually come across me. "At least your name's not on anything," my mother once said. When I mentioned that I would not mind being thanked in the acknowledgments, she said, "Let me tell you a story." It would be the first time I heard this story, but not the last. "In our homeland," she went on, "there was a reporter who said the government tortured the people in prison. So the government does to him exactly what he said they did to others. They send him away, and no one ever sees him again. That's what happens to writers who put their names on things." By the time Victor Devoto chose me, I had resigned myself to being one of those writers whose names did not appear on book covers. His agent had given him a book that I had ghostwritten. Its ostensible author, the father of a boy who had shot and killed several people at his school. "I identify with the father's guilt," Victor said to me. He was the sole survivor of an airplane crash, 173 others having perished, including his wife and children. What was left of him appeared on all the talk shows, his body there, but not much else. The voice was a soft monotone, and the eyes, on the occasions they looked up, seemed to hold within them the silhouettes of mournful people. His publisher said that it was urgent that he finish his story while audiences still remembered the tragedy, and this was my preoccupation on the day my dead brother returned to me. My mother woke me while it was still dark outside and said, "Don't be afraid." Through my open door, the light from the hallway stung. Why would I be afraid? When she said my brother's name, I did not think of my brother. He had died long ago. I closed my eyes and said I did not know anyone by that name. But she persisted. "He's here to see us," she said, stripping off my covers and tugging at me until I rose, eyes half shut. She was 63, moderately forgetful, and when she led me to the living room and cried out, I was not surprised. "He was right here," she said, kneeling by her floral armchair as she felt the carpet. "It's wet." She crawled to the front door in her cotton pajamas, following the trail. When I touched the carpet, it was damp. For a moment I twitched in belief, and the silence of the house at 4 in the morning felt ominous. Then I noticed the sound of rainwater in the gutters, and the fear that had gripped my neck relaxed its hold. My mother must have opened the door, gotten drenched, then come back inside. I knelt by her as she crouched next to the door, her hand on the knob, and said, "You're imagining things." I know what I saw. Brushing my hand off her shoulder, she stood up, anger illuminating her dark eyes. "He walked. He talked. He wanted to see you." "Then where is he, Ma?" "I don't see anyone." "Of course you don't," she sighed, as if I were the one, unable to grasp the obvious. "He's a ghost, isn't he?" I don't even like ghosts. I'm easily scared. And so perhaps that was one reason why it took me 50 drafts over 17 years to write this story. And because it didn't break me as a writer, I became a writer. But this story really haunted me, the difficulty of writing this story, the difficulty of thinking about ghosts. And I thought, yes, I too am someone who's haunted by the past. I too am haunted by this war. I too am haunted by everything that my parents left behind, including my adopted sister. But I also realized at a certain point that perhaps we, the Vietnamese, the refugees, are also haunting America and Americans as well, through things like all of these movies that Hollywood was making, through this fact that the Vietnam War keeps coming back, but also through a very personal example for me. And that was what happened to my parents' store. So in 1978, when my parents opened that grocery store in downtown San Jose was really run down. A rough place, a violent place. And despite what that sign in the store window said, it was mostly Vietnamese refugees who wanted to come to downtown to open businesses, not anybody else. Through the 70s and 80s, I remember downtown San Jose as being a vibrant place full of Vietnamese businesses. But City Hall really couldn't care less about downtown San Jose until something called Silicon Valley happened. And then all this money started to come in to San Jose. And City Hall thought, well, wouldn't it be nice if we had a new City Hall that reflected the new San Jose? Guess where they built the new City Hall? Not on my parents' property, but right across the street from my parents' property. And City Hall forced my parents and most of the other Vietnamese businesses to sell their property as they sought to renovate and to revitalize a San Jose, downtown San Jose, that the Vietnamese refugees had already revitalized. And this was very painful for my parents, obviously, but also very painful for me, because I'd grown up seeing what working in that store had done to my parents. It's exhausting work, and they had sacrificed so much for my brother and me. So for years and years and years after this, I would come back to San Jose, I would come back to downtown San Jose, but I could never go drive by my parents' store, or what was left of it. And I could never drive by City Hall. And then something called the Pulitzer Prize happened. And City Hall thought, wouldn't it be great to have Viet back to give him a commendation? So I said, yes, of course. And I came to City Hall and I told them the exact same story I'm telling you. Be careful when you invite writers to tell you stories. So all this time, for a couple of decades, I had thought that City Hall had built a parking garage on my parents' property. So I came back to City Hall for this commendation, went up from the garage, from underneath City Hall to the street, looked across the street from City Hall to where my parents' store used to be, and there was no parking garage. It was a parking lot. And not just any parking lot, it was a half-empty parking lot. And it reminded me of a line that I wrote in a Sympathizer, which is that America's greatest architectural contribution to the world is the parking lot. And I also realized City Hall would rather look out on a half-empty parking lot than look out on a mom-and-pop Vietnamese grocery store. And I thought about how my mom and dad's store had been erased from the landscape, and about how all these other Vietnamese businesses had been erased from downtown San Jose, so that if you came to downtown San Jose today, you would never know the Vietnamese people had been there. We had been erased from the American landscape. And I wrote the only autobiographical short story of my life, War Years in the Refugees, about that grocery store. And The Refugees has just been translated into Vietnamese in Vietnam. And the one story that the government censored was War Years. So we've been erased in Vietnam too. This is why I became a writer. If we didn't have writers to tell stories about people like this, experiences like this, places like this, they would be erased forever. So storytelling is so important to me, to the American experience, for us to be able to remember these ghosts and to contest that idea that Americans have been driven out of business by the Vietnamese, or by fill in the blank, which is what the story, what that sign is really about. First it was the Chinese, then it was the Japanese, then it was the Filipinos, then it was the Koreans, and then it was the Vietnamese. And now look at us. We're your doctors, or your manicurists, as the case might be. So I'm going to end with the last bit from Black-Eyed Women. And it is very much about storytelling and about ghosts. Ever since my father died a few years ago, my mother and I lived together politely. We shared a passion for words, but I preferred the silence of writing, while she loved to talk. She constantly fed me gossip and stories, the only kind I enjoyed concerning my father back when he was a man I did not know, young and happy. Then came stories of terror, like the one about the reporter, the moral being that life, like the police, enjoys beating people now and again. Finally, there was her favorite kind, the ghost story, of which she knew many, some firsthand. Aunt Six died of a heart attack at 76, she told me once, twice, or perhaps 3 times, repetition being her habit. I never took her stories seriously. She lived in Vũng Tàu, and we were in Nha Trang. I was bringing dinner to the table when I saw Aunt Six sitting there in her nightgown. Her long gray hair, which she usually wore in a chignon, was loose and fell over her shoulders and in her face. I almost dropped the dishes. When I asked her what she was doing here, she just smiled. She stood up, kissed me, and turned me toward the kitchen. When I turned around again to see her, she was gone. It was her ghost. Uncle confirmed it when I called. She had passed away that morning in her own bed. Aunt Six died a good death, according to my mother, at home and with family, her ghost simply making the rounds to say farewell. My mother repeated her aunt's story while we sat at the kitchen table the morning she claimed to have seen my brother, her son. I had brewed her a pot of green tea and taken her temperature despite her protests, the result being, as she had predicted, normal. Waving the thermometer at me, she said he must have disappeared because he was tired. After all, he had just completed a journey of thousands of miles across the Pacific. So how did he get here? He swam. She gave me a pitying look. That's why he was wet. He was an excellent swimmer, I said, humoring her. What did he look like? Exactly the same. It's been 25 years. He hasn't changed at all? They always look exactly the same as when you last saw them. I remembered how he looked the last time, and any humor that I felt vanished. The stunned look on his face, the open eyes that did not flinch even with the splintered board of the boat's deck pressing against his cheek. I did not want to see him again, assuming there was something or someone to see. After my mother left for her shift at the salon, I tried to go back to sleep, but could not. His eyes stared at me whenever I closed my own. Only now was I conscious of not having remembered him for months. I had long struggled to forget him, but just by turning a corner in the world or in my mind, I could run into him, my best friend. From as far back as I can recall, I could hear his voice outside our house calling my name. That was my signal to follow him down our village's lanes and pathways, through jackfruit and mangrove groves to the dikes and fields, dodging shattered palm trees and bomb craters. At the time, this was a normal childhood. Looking back, however, I could see that we had passed our youth in a haunted country. Our father had been drafted, and we feared that he would never return. Before he left, he had dug a bomb shelter next to our home, a sandbag bunker whose roof was braced by timber. Even though it was hot and airless, dank with the odor of the earth and alive with the movement of worms, we often went to play there as little children. When we were older, we went to study and tell stories. I was the best student in my school, excellent enough for my teacher to teach me English after hours, lessons I shared with my brother. He, in turn, told me tall tales, folklore, and rumors. When airplanes shrieked overhead and we huddled with my mother in the bunker, he whispered ghost stories in my ear to distract me. Except, he insisted, they were not ghost stories. They were historical accounts from reliable sources, the ancient crones who chewed betel nut and spat its red juice while squatting on their haunches in the market, tending coal stoves or overseeing baskets of wares. Our land's confirmed residents, they said, included the upper half of a Korean lieutenant, launched by a mine into the branches of a rubber tree, a scalped black American floating in the creek not far from his downed helicopter, his eyes in the exposed half-moon of his brain glistening above the water, and a decapitated Japanese private groping through cassava shrubbery for his head. These invaders came to conquer our land and now would never go home, the old ladies said, cackling and exposing lacquered teeth, or so my brother told me. I shivered with delight in the gloom, hearing those black-eyed women with my own ears, and it seemed to me that I would never tell stories like those. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks. I am mic'd, yes. Not yet.
How about now? I'm not on. Oh,
No,
now
you're
we're on. That's great. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jeremy.
That was very inspiring. So we're going to offer people the opportunity to ask questions. There are 2 microphones up here. And so if you do have a question to ask, then feel free to come up. But maybe to start this off, maybe I can ask a question. So at the end of the story, War Years, I guess it's you. I didn't realize it was autobiographical, but the child who's kind of the narrator, his mother gives him a $5 bill and sends him into a convenience store and says, buy anything you want. And the kid is kind of overwhelmed, and the story ends right there. And I'm curious, what about your experience were you trying to tell us at that moment when this child is faced with all of America, so to speak, on sale?
Well, I'm glad you didn't know it was autobiographical. My parents may not know it's autobiographical either. They haven't read the story yet. But you know, that was based on what it was like to grow up in that Vietnamese refugee grocery store. And I worked in there a few times, but my parents mostly did not want me to work there. You know, the kind of work I did for them was actually after they came home and after, we had dinner, I would be their accountant. I did all the checks and I did all this when I was 10 or 11 years old, right? So I knew what the value of money was supposed to be about. And the incident that preceded that incident in the story was the father, and this is a true story, giving to that little boy when he asks for an allowance. The little boy asked for an allowance, and the father said, "An allowance? Let me give you a bill, an itemized bill of everything you've cost us over the years since your birth." That really happened to me. So I grew up with this idea that money was precious. And you sweat and you worked and you were shot. You risked your life for these kinds of things. And my parents really did. So when that little boy who is sort of me gets that money from his mom, $5 is not a big deal to middle-class Americans. $5 is enormously important for the mother and for that little boy. And this is what he's been wanting. He's wanted to have this opportunity to live the American dream, the American lifestyle, and now he's been given the money and he's confronting a 7-Eleven filled with all these goodies and he's frozen because he's stricken both by this overwhelming sense of choice that is American capitalism, but he's also stricken by guilt because he knows what this money is. It's literally blood money. Right? And that I feel is for me the dilemma of so many of these new Americans. They come here to pursue the American dream, but to pursue the American dream, they have to sacrifice so much. And so for them, it's never just about easy consumption. It's also always being aware of the pain of what it took to get there and to make this money that could afford you that American dream.
No volunteers yet? No. Oh,
I think we have one.
Maybe you could introduce yourself.
Yes. Is this on?
It is on.
It is, okay. I'm Eleni Kundriots from the English department. Thank you very much for your talk. If I can be allowed, I'll ask a question about the Sympathizer, which I read a couple of years ago. And I have to admit that your reading, which was very beautiful, stressed the humor in a way that I hadn't quite gotten it when I was reading. I mean, I certainly perceived the humor, but the voice is very hard-hitting. I mean, the novel as a whole is very hard-hitting. But the question I wanted to ask is about torture in the novel. And I was hoping you would talk a little bit about the relationship between the task of narrating a war story and the centrality of torture, the way in which you structured your novel.
Well, I'm sad you didn't find it funny.
No, I did find it funny, but funny in a different way.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun writing the novel. Especially the squid scene. I was laughing to myself. It's only semi-autobiographical, by the way, for those of you who've read it. But when I was writing the novel, it was from 2011 to 2013, and I knew in writing the novel at a certain point that it would have to deal with torture because there was torture. There's always torture in war. It doesn't matter what war we're talking about. And of course, at the time, from 2011 to 2013, the war in Iraq was very, very hot. And Abu Ghraib had come onto the newspaper pages, right, or screens. And all these revelations of American-sponsored or directly American torture were happening. And I was doing research on torture practices, which it's a really sobering experience. Right. And what I discovered was that these things that we were seeing in the newspapers or on the screens of what Americans were doing to the Iraqis were a direct descendant from what the CIA had developed in the 1950s and then applied in Vietnam in the 1960s and 70s and then applied in Latin America in the 1970s and 1980s. So the memory of all these torture techniques that we had as a country developed and refined was surfacing again in a war that was itself a sequel to, from my point of view, a sequel to the Vietnam War. And so I felt that when I was writing the torture scenes in the novel, that it was both about the Vietnam War, but also about what was happening in the present. And then, of course, the challenge was, well, how do you write about torture? How do you write about something that's so horrible and try to convey it, and yet keep the reader still wanting to read? That was actually a lot of fun as a writer to try to figure out how to do that. But I felt that what the CIA had done, what they had discovered in the 1950s, was that physical torture was not really productive. What was productive was psychological torture, sensory deprivation, humiliation, these kinds of things. And so that was what had to be conveyed. And I felt that what was really crucial was not the psychology of the torturer; it was the psychology of the victim as he was undergoing that. And so I had to get into his mind, and so the entire experience of the torture sequence is told from his point of view, and it tries to at least give us some kind of replication of what it feels like when your sense of your body and time and place are completely eliminated by the impact of this torture, which is what they're designed to do. So that's what the literary and political effect of that sequence is supposed to do, is to get us to feel to a certain extent what it might be like to have our sense of self dissolved through this experience.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So maybe while people are thinking about questions, so you talked in your address about this vast collection of Vietnam War movies, and of course recently there was the Ken Burns and Lynn Novick Vietnam documentary. And I'm wondering if so for people, I mean, I'm old enough to remember that time, but for people, many of our students, this is really ancient history. How would you advise people what questions should people be asking themselves when they, let's say, watch the Ken Burns Vietnam War documentary, and what's the right perspective so that you're not, so that you have some way of sort of making sense of what you're seeing and getting a better point of view on it. Not so much Apocalypse Now, but something which the Ken Burns work, which is, purports to be a serious work of history.
Right. Well, many people have reacted very positively to that documentary, and I've only seen 45 minutes. which was shown to me by Lynn Novick in their production studio. And the reason I didn't watch all 18 hours of the documentary is that I don't have the time, and because I knew if I did, I'd have to say yes to these TV shows that were coming to me, asking me to be the professional Vietnamese yet again, and give us your expert opinion on this documentary and how it represents Vietnam and the Vietnamese and so on. And the 45 minutes that I saw, and everything I know about the Burns effect, is that they are part of good storytelling. In good storytelling, the impact is to seduce us, to get us to identify with the point of view that's being told, and that's very pleasurable, right? But what I would tell people is, you have to after you've experienced that pleasure, you have to step back and think about whose point of view is the story being told from. And I think that's really, really hard for people to get distance from, right? That's why I think for so many Americans, when they say Vietnam, they mean the Vietnam War, means the American War, and they've watched all these American movies about the Vietnam War, and it never occurs to most Americans that these movies are mostly about Americans and not about Vietnamese people. So for example, I went to Italy, met Italian leftists who really oppose the United States, oppose the Vietnam War, think Americans are imperialists, but they love Apocalypse Now. They supported Vietnamese people, but they didn't even recognize the marginal role that Vietnamese people occupied in that movie. So the Ken Burns documentary, from everything that I've heard about, does incorporate more Vietnamese voices into it, from North Vietnam, from the North and from the South, and enemies and allies. But the frame or the point of view is still an American point of view. And for me, that's not enough. So to write the Sympathizer or to write the refugees from Vietnamese points of view was absolutely crucial, because we have to tell our stories from our perspective, where we're at the center of the story. And that's what I meant when I said that if you're a part of the majority, all the stories are about you. You take it for granted that you're at the center of all these stories, and people who are minorities can never take that for granted.
Good evening. Thank
Hello.
you very much. My name is Sheila Amder. I'm a member of the community here. But I particularly was struck by your comment about the parallels between what you're writing about and the refugees. I'm just finishing the Sympathizer. I haven't read the refugees yet, but that speaking about Vietnamese who are refugees, are refugees in this country, who came to this country, that it's also parallel to other refugee groups who have come or are trying to come, but that at sometimes people who are the most recent refugees are those who oppose their coming. And I don't think that's just necessarily true for Vietnamese, because I've seen it. We have a very large group here that has been very active in trying to resettle Syrian refugees. And some of the, I'd say some of the opposition I've seen has come from people who themselves not necessarily were refugees, but were immigrants, who were parts of immigrant communities. I'm here, I have mine, but I'd like to know what you think is behind that, because it's somewhat shocking, since I had family a long time ago who were refugees.
Well, I think it's very American, right? I mean, part of the American idea of ourselves, the mythology, is that we invent ourselves anew here, which means we forget about the past. And so it's perfectly makes sense that people who have come here think of themselves as Americans now, and not necessarily as immigrants or as refugees, or if they're descended from immigrants or from refugees, they've forgotten that, right? Or they ignore that. But the other reason why, and it's a very human reason, I think, is self-interest. Even if you have been the recipient of someone else's aid or charity or empathy, as these refugees who have now become citizens have been, it doesn't necessarily make you more empathetic to others. Right? And this is a real tragedy, but it's also really, really human. And that's why I think my work is, part of the point that I want to make is that, yes, I'm writing about Vietnamese people, because it's important to write about Vietnamese people. But I write about Vietnamese people not simply to talk about how great they are, but I also write about how screwed up they are as well, and about how they're capable of all the human failings also, so that those who have been rescued will turn around and not rescue others. And we have to do better than that. And that's part of what I think my role is in coming to give these kinds of talks, but also what the role of literature is to try to expand the borders of our imagination and the boundaries of our empathy. And I think that we're all capable of empathy, almost everybody, okay? Even if our empathy only extends to our family or to people who we think are like us. But that's still empathy, even if there's a circumference and we say, well, everybody outside of that circumference doesn't deserve my empathy, as these new refugees would be the case, right? I think the project that I'm engaged in and so many other writers and so many other lovers of literature and so many other advocates of refugees are engaged in is expanding the circle of the near and the dear to include more and more of the far and the feared. And that's been the human project over thousands of years, right? Thousands of years ago, we were killing people in other villages and other cities. And now we just play, football games instead. And instead, we kill people outside of the nation state. So the optimistic view on this is, well, we've made progress. And we got to get to the point where 1,000 years in the future, people will just be playing football games between nations, and they won't kill each other because of those differences, or keep each other out.
We will go to the other microphone there.
I'm Chris Viles, an English. How's it going? I was just wondering, so you alluded to this in your talk, but how has your work, whether it's the Sympathizer or refugees, been received in Vietnam? Because obviously there's parts of your narrative that seems like the Vietnamese government would embrace, and then parts of your narratives that they would not embrace, right? And so, yeah, I'm just basically, and then trying to get at, how ordinary people, have received your work's a different question too, but just wondering if you could speak to that.
Well, when the Sympathizer was the first one to come out, and when it came out in the United States, it was well reviewed and everything, and I think it got some attention in Vietnam. People knew that there was this Vietnamese guy getting some attention for his novel, but it wasn't a big deal up until the point the novel won the Pulitzer Prize. And I'll tell you an anecdote, which is when I won the Pulitzer Prize, I was actually on the road, and it didn't even occur to me to call my parents and tell them I won the Pulitzer Prize because I'm Asian, I'm supposed to win the Pulitzer Prize. You don't brag about that kind of thing, okay? You just set the bar higher. So, but 2 days later, he called me on the road and he said, the relatives in Vietnam called, you won the Pulitzer Prize. He was really happy. And so the news had made it back, but from what I was told, in two different ways. One was that in state media, official media, they've said, well, yes, someone won the Pulitzer Prize. Who that someone was, they didn't say. It was in the unofficial media that they said, my name won the Pulitzer Prize. So I think there was that ambivalence in Vietnam that, yes, it's great that a Vietnamese person wins this prize in another country, although it's ironic that Vietnamese people are validated by that, but it's still kind of great. But it's very difficult because they know what the topic of the Sympathizer is about, and it's a novel that sets out to offend everybody, but in the last quarter of the novel, it sets out to offend the Communist Party. So then the Refugees comes out, and that actually, I was really surprised when all three of my recent books were sold in Vietnam to Vietnamese publishing houses. The Refugees was the first one translated and published, and like I said, this one story was removed, apparently because the story of the war years is that an anti-communist Vietnamese activist comes to this grocery store and demands money to help the anti-communist cause, and she says all kinds of mean things about communism, okay? So apparently that's not acceptable. But the book, when it was published, The Refugees, apparently it's done well. I mean, the reviews in the press have been good, the reviews online have been good, and I think, Vietnam as a whole is trying to come to grips with what it means to have a diasporic population of about 4 million or so Vietnamese people scattered around the world, most of whom left as refugees or are the descendants of refugees. And so there's a certain amount of openness to that now, where if you read certain kinds of Vietnamese official histories or accounts, they'll say, yes, there are refugees overseas. They won't exactly say why or why they were fleeing or anything like that. So they're trying to get to that point where they can have that sort of reconciliation. And partly it's because, I think there's a real desire for that, but also because Vietnamese overseas people have a lot of money to bring back to Vietnam. But it's still a very delicate affair, so a certain amount of information is let in. So, 80% of the Refugees was published, but not the other part. That's the kind of negotiation that's taking place. And the Sympathizer, the translation is finished. And it's what happens in Vietnam is you have a publishing house that is responsible for the translation and the publication, but that publishing house has to get approval from another publishing house that gives them the publishing certificate. Now that's where the censorship mechanism comes in. And the manuscript is now being reviewed by this other publishing house, and I'll be stunned if they give us a publishing certificate for this novel. So we'll just have to wait and see.
Hi. So I can relate to your first story when you talked about haunting stories and having to sacrifice a lot. Oftentimes my mom will tell me about stories. So she's a Chinese immigrant, not a refugee, but there was war in her childhood, but also a lot of happiness. Sometimes she'll talk about the sense of community she had in a tight-knit neighborhood. And she'll talk about not feeling like an outsider, not feeling racialized. So I was wondering if you've ever felt, have you ever imagined a past where maybe you're a Vietnamese young person and you are part of a community and you don't have to worry about telling these stories to humanize your people because you just are part of the people? Have you ever?
Yeah. I think everybody, most people I think who have been displaced or who have fled because of whatever reason, including war, have probably thought about alternative histories. What would have happened if something else had taken place? What would have happened if there had not been a war, right? So in my case, I've quite often thought about, well, what would have happened if I had been born earlier and I would have been an adult during the Vietnam War? What kind of choices would I have made? Or what would have happened if there had been no war and I had grown up in Vietnam in a unified country? And would I have felt completely and fully Vietnamese? If it was a communist Vietnam like it is now, I would not have felt fully Vietnamese because my parents were Catholic and the Catholics are persecuted in Vietnam. But let's say in some kind of ideal circumstance, those divisions didn't exist. What would it be like? And I think that I would be like a lot of other majority people, majority Vietnamese people. And the reason I stress this is because one of the things about being a refugee and being a minority that's good, besides giving me the requisite emotional damage to become a writer, one of the reasons that it's good is that for me, it's provided me with a sense of justice and awareness of what it means to be a minority, and awareness of what it means to be a part of the majority or not a part of the majority, and awareness of the need for empathy. And I recognize that, it doesn't really matter whether someone is a part of the majority in the United States or in Vietnam. They have majority privileges in both cases. And so the Vietnamese people who are part of the majority in Vietnam, of which I'm a part, they're just as capable of being racist as Americans are of being racist here. And so I think about that, like, what if I was a racist? What if I grew up with all these privileges in Vietnam and I just took for granted that I was a part of the majority? I could be a racist. And that would be sad. So it works both ways. It could be like this wonderful, heartwarming experience where I'm just a part of the community, or it could be I'm a part of this racist community that's unified by our love for ourselves, our empathy for ourselves, and our hatred for somebody else. So I think that's one of the valuable experiences to draw from refugee and minority histories, is this awareness of how we could have been different, but in a worse way, if we were a part of the majority, and how we have to work against that.
Hello there. So I must admit at first that I was going to cheat. At first I just came up here to let you know that the Asian invasion is an ongoing campaign. It's still being waged. However, as I was standing here, I did remember the part where you mentioned the ghost stories that your mother would tell you. And I don't know much about Vietnamese culture. I'm Chinese. So I don't know if ghost stories are a thing or something for the Vietnamese, or it's just a general human thing that people do to entertain each other over a campfire or whenever during being bombed by the Americans. However, as a Chinese, I do know several Chinese stories pretty well, being born in America, like The Journey to the West, The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, and The Red Mansion, for example. And I'm an avid video gamer, so I always thought it would be awesome if the series called the Total War franchise would recreate the Romance of the Three Kingdoms in one of their games. And lo and behold, a few months ago, it actually happened. The company announced Total War, Three Kingdoms, and I was just pumped. I was like, oh my God, it's finally happening. I'm going to get a Chinese game from an American company. And I scroll down to the comment section. This is on YouTube. And the first comment I see is, what? Another Total War game that's like about this stupid story? I want Total War Britannia. I want this more European. There's not enough European games. They have 5 games already that's European, I may say. They already have covered Napoleon. Sorry, I'm going on a tangent. So I was just kind of struck speechless, by this comment, and because it wasn't alone. It was a general trend. Actually, there seemed to be no one excited about Total War Three Kingdoms for some reason. And it kind of struck me that as important as, because Journey to the West is an awesome story. For those who aren't very well acquainted, it's like one of the iconic Chinese stories. It's one of the 4 main novels from China. And I honestly was kind of struck that people don't really, not only do they not care about the story, they didn't know about the story, they just didn't care. Like, they know that UConn, you can ask like a lot of people, do you know that? Yeah,
maybe we can, can you just get a question out there, because we have other people who are waiting?
I just want to know, so when I try to incorporate Chinese stories into my writing, so I was just wondering if you've ever had that experience of incorporating Vietnamese folklore and stories into your writing and the critical response you've gotten related to it.
Well, first of all, I'm not surprised at all by the response to the Total War Three Kingdoms series that you're talking about. I'd advise you never to read the comment section of YouTube or anything else if you don't want to get a deep look into the darkest parts of the American psyche. Okay? So, I mean, the whole idea of the Asian invasion is still with us. Now, of course, it's still North Korea, it's still China. And so it's no surprise that on the one hand, the corporation that makes Total War wants to tap into the Chinese market, that's capitalism, and there's no surprise that a considerable part of the American population wants to resist that. That's the same dynamic that's playing out across the country right now, right? So nothing has really changed in that regard. What has changed, of course, is that we have people like you, a younger generation, and when I look at you and your youthful optimism, I realize that I am more than halfway to death. It's statistically true.
At least we age well.
Yeah, we age well, that's right. But I'm still statistically more than halfway to death, okay? But the point is that we have people like you who are angry, I think, a little bit angry, and passionate, and want to see a change in the stories, and are aware now that even something like gaming is driven by stories, is driven by frames, right? Who is the person behind the gun, and who is the person in the gun scope? That's a narrative right there. And that narrative is related to all of the other stories that we tell about who belongs in this country, who doesn't belong here, who belongs in the stories, who doesn't belong here, who should be shooting, who should be shot, right? And so you have to go out there and you have to write your own stories. You should become not just a video gamer, but a video game designer and get some different stories out there and incorporate things like the Three Kingdoms. In my case, I haven't, in the case of the refugees, ghost stories really are a part of Vietnamese culture. I heard them when I was growing up and they freaked me out. And in the Sympathizer, there are references to Vietnamese sayings and to folk stories and to history and things like that. So it's important to know these kinds of things because it allows you to make your stories more layered and more complex so that you are capable of referencing both Total War, this American cultural production, and Three Kingdoms, which is amazing.
So I think we have time maybe for a couple more questions. I think we're on this side now.
Hello? Hi.
Hi.
Hi, I'm Daniel. I'm from Wesleyan University. I actually came here with my VSA squad over here.
Thank you.
Yeah. Also, UConn's VSA invited us, so shout out to them. We have a little Asian invasion in that corner, if you didn't notice. But yeah, I'm going to keep it short and simple. As a second-generation American, I have to ask, how the hell did you convince your parents that studying English was a practical and realistic idea? Because props to you, you got more balls and courage than I could ever muster up.
I'm so sad to see that things haven't changed to the second generation.
Yeah, no, it's still a thing.
Your parents should know better.
Exactly.
Well, you know what? I think my parents are I will tell you something about my parents. You know, they grew up poor in North Vietnam, in a poor rural village about 30 minutes from where Ho Chi Minh was born. And this region is famous for producing hardcore communists and hardcore Catholics. And my parents were the latter. And because they didn't have much of an education, the two things they wanted for me was to become a good Catholic and to get a good education. They got 1 out of 2. Okay? And surprisingly, they are not liberal in any way, shape, or form, except for one thing, which is that they were satisfied just with the idea of an education. And I was helped by the fact that I had my older brother who did the whole model minority thing, right? Graduated valedictorian of his high school, went to Harvard, and he majored in philosophy and pre-med, and he became a doctor. They got the best of both worlds. And so he told me, look, when I said I wanted to be an English major, he said, look, just don't tell mom and dad that that's really what you want. Just say that you're going to do English and pre-med. And I did pre-med for 11 weeks. I did honors chemistry, okay? And I got a B+ in honors chemistry. And I had a Vietnamese lab partner, and he wouldn't let me touch the lab. That's how I got a B+, and also partial credit. So I understood nothing. And I was like, I would at least like to know what I'm studying here in order to get a B+, and I would just be horrified if I never knew that my doctor was some dude who got a B+ in organic chemistry and didn't know what was going on. So I couldn't take it anymore, and so then I told my parents, I'm just going to be pre-law. So that, basically, this is a very classic Asian technique. Lie, lie, lie. In other words, make your parents happy. As long as they're happy and you're happy, everything's cool. They don't have to know what's going on, okay? And
I don't think that's limited to Asians.
Okay, that's true. It works for other contexts too. But obviously, it's very difficult if they're paying your tuition, and you have to acknowledge what you're majoring in. But I was lucky. I was able to delay. And then when it came time to get a PhD, I think they were just happy I was going to get a doctorate. So that was a point of negotiation. Double major, that's another option. That was basically my brother's strategy. Do the pre-med, whatever that is, and do something else that your heart desires, because this is your one chance to have this much time to study what you want to study, and it'd be a shame if you can't do that. Good luck, though.
Yeah, thanks.
How's it going? My name is Aaron. I'm taking a class. We read. I'm forgetting the title of the book. The nonfiction.
Nothing Ever Dies.
Nothing Ever Dies.
Yes. So, in reading that, and then hearing your discussion and your account of, being young and watching Apocalypse Now, and seeing, yourself get split in two. When you watch films today, that war films, and you discussed American Sniper, and films of that nature, do you still feel split in two and identify with those individuals when they're painted as divisive or not necessarily as innocents in that regard?
Yeah, it's really hard for me to enjoy certain kinds of stories now. This is what having a critical consciousness does to you. It ruins some certain kinds of stories, So when I watched American Sniper, it wasn't a good movie for me, right? Because I could totally see what was happening was simply a replication of these other American movies that had been made about Vietnam and about Korea and about Japan and so on, where it was simply now an Iraqi who was in the role of the Vietnamese. This is another version of the Oriental, right? So I didn't feel split in two because it wasn't quite as intimate for me, but I certainly did not identify with the character of the sniper in American Sniper. And this is what happens once you start to develop empathy and awareness. It ruins for you the very basic narratives that give so many people pleasure. Another American driven out of business is a whole story that gives a lot of people pleasure because they identify with that American who's being driven out of business by that scary other. And underlying all that is the idea of violence. You have to remember that in the 1980s, when Japan was that entity driving Americans out of business, There were Americans going around, destroying cars in economic protests and killing Vincent Chin in Detroit because they thought he was Japanese in an American auto town. So once you are able to see that things like Another American Driven Out of Business is based upon this division between us and them, and American Sniper is based on that division between us and them, it ruins the whole pleasure of that very simple story. And that's a good thing, because now we can tell better stories after that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So if it's okay with you, maybe we'll finish off this line. We got two people here.
All right, hi, my name is Varun. I'm a UConn alum, and thank you for your work and for talking today. I think I really connected as second generation. I'm Asian American. My ancestors are refugees, and grew up. Came to UConn pre-med and ended up graduating with ethnic studies and sociology.
Yes.
Becoming a community organizer, working in immigrant communities, and so and The Sympathizer is one of my favorite books. And so I just wanted to. And to me, it was really a love letter, among many things, a love letter to revolutionaries, a love letter to members of the diaspora broadly, and also, to me, an indictment of US capitalism and imperialism. And so I guess my question, and also to me, that line about, the unripe ideals of youth, I think really has stuck with me, this idea that there's, so I'd love to hear about how, as you've aged, how you're sort of like, since you've written that sort of paragraph about the unripe ideals of youth, some of the truth, part of the truth lies in that. How's your perspective on social issues or the movement, social movements changed? And then my other question, I guess, is thinking about, like, as many times as we tell these stories, it feels like it's falling on deaf ears, even on the left, which still cling to this idea that the U.S. is something that can be reformed, or that there's sort of what we need is diversity and inclusion, versus dismantling this whole corrupt system that is profiting off of the bodies of Black and brown people. So I'm just wondering, like, why do you think that people hear these stories like yours, which to me is so clear, and continue to I guess for me, don't especially white liberals tend to not feel like there's something that can be redeemed, which for me is really clearly that it's broken, and we have to get to the root of. If we're going to get to any liberation, we have to get to the root of it and really dismantle the existing system, right? So,
man, you remind me of me when I was your age, and that's great, because to answer your second question first, it's the power of stories is such that it influences not even just what we tell, but what we hear. So like I said, I could publish a novel like The Sympathizer, which I can shoot of as, very strong political critique and so on, and one that was very critical of American warfare and of Vietnamese communism and all that. But it was read as an immigrant story, because automatically there is that narrative of the immigrant there. And that's what I mean, that when we use the word immigrant, we so often use it to contain all of the dirty, contaminated histories and the political contradictions that have existed to bring the immigrant into existence. But instead, we use the immigrant story to talk about how the immigrant comes here and becomes an American and affirms the American dream. And I will say that even though that's how the book has been read by many people in the press and so on, there was a way in which that narrative was disruptive enough so that The Sympathizer almost didn't get published, which was that when we sent The Sympathizer out to 14 publishers, 13 out of 14 rejected the book. And the 14th editor who bought it was English. And not only that, I found out later he was mixed race. He was half Indian, right? And I think the reason why this happened was because when I wrote The Sympathizer, I knew exactly how the novel should end for Americans. Because this is a novel that's partly about communist disillusionment, and that's a common genre here in the United States. And the narrative of communist disillusionment ends with the former communist, basically embracing the American dream, right? Renouncing communism, embracing the American dream, coming to the United States, getting happy on McDonald's or whatever. And that was why it was very deliberate for me at the end of the novel that doesn't happen. He is extremely critical of communism, but he doesn't turn around and say, "Get me to America," right? That's not how the novel ends, and I think that left so many editors uncomfortable. They didn't know how to make sense out of that. So it is possible, at some level to disturb and to disrupt people. But literature itself, as I said, can't do that work on its own. You still need these social and political movements to working in conjunction. And then that gets to your first question, which is really a good one for me personally, because basically when I was in college, I was not just an English major, I was an ethnic studies major, which is like taking two useless majors and multiplying them together. Okay? And the moment I stepped foot on the Berkeley campus, I was immediately radicalized. And within like 7 or 8 weeks, I was getting arrested. All this great stuff. Never told my parents about that either. To this day, they don't know about it. And so I was passionate and angry, and I was ready to go out there and change the world. And then I went to graduate school. And getting a PhD, was for me still a political act. Like I still thought literary criticism can change the world and all that. But becoming a professional really beat a lot of passion out of me. And I ended up by my early 30s, successful professionally and unhappy personally. And becoming a writer, going back to my writing roots, was very much about going back to who I was when I was 20, 21 years old and full of idealism and anger. I don't want to be that person again, literally, because there's a lot of ways in which getting older is good for you. But I wanted to be that person in terms of that idealism and that anger. And that's what becoming a writer made possible for me, is to go back and shuck off all of the professional armor and repression that I put upon myself in order to succeed professionally, and to get back to what I really believed in. And that's something that all of us can learn from younger people. That's one of the reasons why Parkland has been such a big issue, because maybe these teens who are organizing against violence, maybe they're doing some things that are wrong, maybe they would be doing something different if they were older, but their convictions are absolutely right. And their passion can't be contested. And their idealism can't be criticized except to be rendered in a dishonest fashion. And they're the ones who are changing the national conversation, and change has always come, not just from below, but also from the young as well. So that's what I would tell you. You're going to get older and you're going to learn a lot of things, all right? But one thing that you are going to want to hang on to or come back to is the same sense of conviction, idealism, and passion that is true now and will still be true 20 or 40 or 60 years from now.
Thanks. So, you're last person. Thanks.
I don't know how I'm going to follow up on that question, but I guess I have really simple questions for you. Just about you yourself as an author. Do you feel like if you have any future works, do you feel like you can pull more inspiration from your culture, your country, as well as your past and your youth, or do you feel like that category is sort of to you yourself as an author spent? Also, my second question is, after reading The Refugees, I was really, really curious on who Yen actually was. I didn't Google it, I just wanted to know.
All right, so the second question, Yen, is from the story, I'd Love You to Want Me. And it's a story about a professor and his wife. They're older, and the professor is descending into Alzheimer's, basically. And as he descends, he starts calling his wife by another woman's name, Yen. And she can't tell whether Yen really existed or not. Is Yen a figment of this dementia, or is Yen really a woman he had an affair with at some point in the past? And she's tormented by that, right? And we don't know by the end of the story whether there really was a Yen or not. And to be honest, I don't know either. I never decided at some point to reconstruct the professor's life and to decide whether he really had one or didn't. And so that's one of the things that you do when you write fiction. Sometimes you do know a lot of the backstory. You construct entire biographies of people. And sometimes you inhabit a character's point of view, and you know what that character knows, and you don't know what that character doesn't know. And that can be powerful as well. As for your first question, I don't know the answer to that, about whether or not I can still go back to my youth. I think becoming a writer was one of the things that was challenging about becoming a writer, was that I had to go back and think about things that I didn't want to think about. Like that story I told you today about being taken away from my parents and sent to live with a strange family and all that kind of stuff. I mean, I knew that happened, but I spent decades not thinking about it because it was painful. And unfortunately, to be a writer, one of the things that's required is that you go where it hurts. And most people sensibly run away from the things that have hurt them. But writers, one of the things that we draw from is our own emotions. In order to feel, in order to give our characters feelings, we have to feel something, and that means that we have to go where those feelings are within ourselves. And I don't know if I've exhausted that, that history of mine and what happened to me and to my family. I don't think I've exhausted what the Vietnamese American community holds, or what the Vietnamese refugee community holds, or what my trips to Vietnam have held and will hold for me. Now that the refugees is out in Vietnamese, my publisher wants me to go back to do a book tour in Vietnam. I'm like, I don't know about that. let me see how the government reacts to the Sympathizer before I decide to go back to Vietnam. And I don't think they're going to throw me in jail, but before they turn me back at the border, which has happened to people. So I don't know, and that's part of the excitement and the fear of being a writer, is that you really don't know where the stories are going to come from, and where the emotions are going to come from, and you hope that the stories and the emotions will keep coming.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think you left us in a very good place. Can we have a round of applause for
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, too.
Thank you so much for sharing your work and your thoughts with us, and for visiting.
So thank you so much. Thank you for coming tonight.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, John.